My own son looked me in the eye and said $20 would be enough for my taxi fare, then laughed like he'd just told the joke of the century. I'm Margaret, and at 69 years old, I thought I'd seen every shade of cruelty this world had to offer. 45 years of marriage to Henry taught me about loyalty, about building something that lasts. We raised Brandon in our Charleston home, sent him to good schools, gave him every advantage. Henry built a logistics empire worth $25 million through decades of 18-hour days and missed family dinners. I was there for every victory, every setback, every late night when he doubted himself. 3 days after I buried the love of my life in the rain, I sat in that mahogany-lined lawyer's office and learned exactly what my husband thought I was worth. $3,000 and an old house. Everything else went to Brandon. The business, the properties, the investments, all of it placed in my son's hands like I was some liability to be managed with pocket change. That's when Brandon made his little joke about the taxi money, and his wife Jessica threw her head back, laughing like I'd already ceased to exist. What they didn't know, what nobody in that room knew except Henry and his lawyer, was that my husband had seen things I hadn't. He'd discovered truths about our son that I'd been too blind to notice. And he'd built something into that will, something that would only activate if Brandon showed his true colors. They had 30 days to prove who they really were. Turns out, they couldn't help themselves. If you want to hear how a grieving widow became a $25 million woman while her son learned what $20 really feels like, subscribe and settle in. This is going to be one hell of a story. The funeral reception at our house should have been my first clue. But grief has a way of making you miss what's right in front of your face. I'd spent 2 days preparing Henry's favorite foods, the same recipes I'd perfected over 4 decades of marriage. Southern comfort food that brought people together. That's what Henry would have wanted. But when Brandon arrived with Jessica, they walked past me like I was part of the catering staff. No hug. No, "How are you holding up, Mom?" Just a quick scan of the room to see who mattered, who had money, who had connections. I watched my son work that room like a political candidate. He positioned himself near Henry's business associates, the ones who controlled contracts worth millions. Every conversation started the same way. He'd mention that he was now in charge of the company, that he had big plans for expansion, that his father's conservative approach had held the business back for years. My chest tightened with each word. Henry had been in the ground for less than 72 hours. Jessica spent the afternoon photographing our antiques with her phone. When I asked what she was doing, she barely looked up and told me she was just appreciating the craftsmanship. But I saw her texting, saw the way she zoomed in on the marks underneath our china cabinet, the signature on the painting Henry and I had bought in Savannah on our 20th anniversary. The guests left around 8. I was exhausted, emotionally hollowed out, ready to finally grieve in private. Brandon and Jessica stayed behind, and I felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe they wanted to comfort me, to share memories of Henry, to be a family in this terrible moment. Brandon poured himself 3 fingers of Henry's best bourbon without asking. He settled into Henry's favorite chair, the leather one by the window where my husband used to read the paper every Sunday morning. The presumption of it made my throat tight. That's when he told me they'd been looking at assisted living facilities in North Charleston. Nothing fancy, he explained, but clean and affordable. He said I'd be happier there, around people my own age, with activities and medical staff nearby. Jessica nodded along, adding that this house was really too much for me to manage alone, that the stairs were dangerous for someone my age, that I should be grateful they were being so proactive about my care. I tried to tell them I wasn't ready to leave my home, that Henry and I had planned for me to stay here, that this was where every memory of our life together lived in the walls and floors and garden. Brandon cut me off mid-sentence and informed me the house was part of the estate assets. According to him, it needed to be liquidated to properly distribute the inheritance. He said this like he was explaining basic math to a confused child. When I mentioned that the will stated the house was mine, Brandon's expression shifted. Something cold moved behind his eyes. He leaned forward and suggested that maybe I hadn't understood the reading correctly, that estate law was complicated, that at my age it was easy to get confused about these things. Jessica touched my hand in a way that made my skin crawl and agreed that the legal language had been very technical, very dense. Maybe I should just trust Brandon to handle the complicated parts. They left around 10, and I sat in the dark living room for hours. The house felt different now, tainted. I kept replaying Brandon's words, the tone he'd used, the way he'd sat in his father's chair like he was already the man of this house. Something was wrong, something beyond normal grief or family tension. At 2 a.m, I walked to Henry's study. He'd always kept meticulous records, files organized in a way that made sense only to him. I started pulling folders, looking for anything related to the will, to our assets, to the business. My hands were shaking, and I felt foolish, like maybe I was just a paranoid old woman who couldn't accept her son's new role. That's when I found the folder marked Brandon, Private. Inside were bank statements, transaction records, emails printed and highlighted. My husband's handwriting filled the margins with dates and amounts. I sat on the floor of his study, reading by lamplight, and felt my entire understanding of my family shift beneath me. Henry had been tracking discrepancies in the company accounts for 8 months. Money moving in ways it shouldn't, contracts being rerouted, payments to shell companies that didn't quite add up. And every trail led back to Brandon. My husband had documented it all with the careful precision of a man who desperately wanted to be wrong about his own son, but couldn't ignore the evidence. The last page was a letter Henry had started but never finished. It began, "Margaret, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've started to see what I saw. I'm so sorry I didn't tell you while I was alive. I kept hoping Brandon would stop, that I could fix this quietly, that I wouldn't have to break your heart along with mine." I pressed the letter to my chest and finally understood why Henry had structured the will the way he did. My son hadn't just been impatient for his inheritance. He'd been stealing it for months, and my husband had known. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every creak of the house sounded like my world collapsing. By sunrise, I'd read through Henry's entire file 3 times, and each pass made the betrayal cut deeper. My husband had discovered Brandon siphoning money through fake vendor contracts. Over 8 months, nearly $2 million had vanished into accounts Brandon controlled. Henry had planned to confront him after finalizing the will, after putting protections in place. He'd run out of time. The doorbell rang at 7:30. I shoved the file under the couch cushions seconds before Brandon let himself in with his old key. He had boxes with him, the kind you use for packing. Jessica trailed behind, already wearing latex gloves like she was about to handle evidence at a crime scene. Brandon announced they were starting the inventory process. He said the estate needed a full accounting of assets, that the sooner we cataloged everything, the sooner we could move forward with the sale. I asked what sale, and he gave me that patient smile people use with difficult children. The house sale, obviously. He'd already contacted 3 realtors and had showings scheduled for next week. I told him I wasn't selling my home. He stopped unpacking boxes and stared at me with something close to pity. Then he explained slowly and clearly that I didn't seem to be grasping the situation. The house was an estate asset worth approximately $2 million. It had to be liquidated. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a legal requirement. At least, that's what he claimed. Jessica started in the dining room, photographing our silver, our crystal, the antique clock that had belonged to Henry's grandmother. I followed her, objecting, and she actually rolled her eyes. She informed me that everything here had been purchased with company funds, which made it company property, which made it Brandon's property now. She suggested I should start thinking about what personal items I wanted to keep, maybe a box or 2 of photo albums, some clothing. They'd be generous about that part. I felt the rage building, but swallowed it down. Years of being a proper Southern wife had taught me to smile when I wanted to scream. So I smiled and told them I needed to lie down, that my heart medication was making me tired. The concern that flashed across Brandon's face was brief and entirely performative. He patted my shoulder and said, of course, I should rest, they'd handle everything. I went upstairs and called Susan from my bedroom. My hands shook so hard I could barely dial. When she answered, everything poured out. The file, the theft, Brandon's invasion of my home, the threats about assisted living. Susan listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she told me to pack Henry's documents and meet her at her house in 20 minutes. She said to use the back door, to make sure Brandon and Jessica didn't see me leave. Getting out of my own house like a fugitive felt surreal. I stuffed the file into my largest purse, grabbed my medication bottles as cover, and told Brandon I was going to the pharmacy. He barely looked up from his inventory spreadsheet. Susan's kitchen table became our war room. She put on reading glasses and went through Henry's documentation page by page. Her lawyer's mind caught things I'd missed, dates that corresponded to business trips Brandon had taken, amounts that matched exactly to bonuses he'd reported, patterns that showed sophistication and planning. But it was the final document in the folder that made Susan's eyebrows shoot up. A letter from Mr. Henderson to Henry, dated 2 weeks before the heart attack. It referenced the dignity clause they'd discussed, confirming it had been added to the will. The letter stated that hidden cameras would be installed in my home after the funeral, and that all phone calls to and from the house would be recorded for the 30-day evaluation period. Henry had set a trap, and Brandon was walking right into it. Susan made 3 calls in rapid succession. The first was to Mr. Henderson, confirming he was still executing Henry's plan. The second was to a locksmith, scheduling a full rekey of my house for the next day when Brandon and Jessica wouldn't be there. The third was to her nephew, a private investigator, asking him to dig into Brandon's financials. She looked at me across that kitchen table and asked if I was ready for war, because that's what this was going to be. My son wasn't going to surrender quietly. When the truth came out, when he lost everything, he'd fight dirty. Could I handle that? I thought about 45 years with Henry, about the man who'd worked himself to death building something he hoped would take care of us both, about how he'd died knowing his own son was a thief but still hoping somehow that Brandon might prove him wrong. I thought about the way my son had pushed past me at the funeral, about Jessica's latex gloves treating my life like contaminated property, about being told I was too old, too confused, too much of a burden to deserve my own home. Then I thought about that joke. $20 for taxi fare. I told Susan I was ready for whatever came next. What I didn't know yet was just how much worse it would get before the 30 days were up. Mr. Henderson confirmed everything the next morning. The cameras were already active, hidden in smoke detectors and picture frames throughout my house. Every interaction with Brandon was being documented. My job, he explained, was to let my son reveal himself. Don't confront him. Don't let him know I suspected anything. Just endure for 23 more days. Playing helpless turned out to be easier than I expected, maybe because part of me had been doing it for years without realizing. Brandon and Jessica came back that afternoon with a real estate agent named Brittany, who had too many teeth and not enough conscience. She walked through my home like she was touring a crime scene, pointing out dated features and necessary renovations. The kitchen where I'd cooked 10,000 meals needed to be gutted. The bathroom where I'd bathed my son as a baby was absolutely tragic. The garden where Henry proposed was wasted space that could be a patio. I played my part. I shuffled when I walked, let my hand shake when I poured coffee, repeated questions I'd already asked. Jessica exchanged knowing looks with Brittany. My own daughter-in-law was performing for an audience, showing this stranger how diminished I was, how clearly I needed to be managed. Brandon pulled Brittany aside in the hallway, but the house had good acoustics. He told her I'd be out within the month, that she should lowball the listing because they needed a quick sale. He mentioned the assisted living facility by name, Meadowbrook Senior Care in North Charleston. I looked it up later. 1-star reviews, health code violations, a wrongful death lawsuit settled out of court. That's where my son was planning to warehouse me. But I smiled and nodded and asked if anyone wanted more coffee. I could feel the camera in the smoke detector above the kitchen doorway recording every word. The mask slipped further 2 days later. I'd gone to the bank to withdraw $500 from my personal account. Money from my part-time work at the library over the years, nothing to do with Henry's estate. The teller looked uncomfortable and told me there was a problem. My account had been flagged. I needed to speak with the manager. Brandon had apparently visited the bank the morning after the funeral. He'd presented Henry's death certificate and the will excerpt showing he controlled the estate. Then he'd convinced them to freeze my personal accounts pending estate resolution. The manager apologized profusely, but said until they received legal clarity, they couldn't process any transactions. My son had cut off my access to my own money. Money I'd earned in an account with only my name on it. I called him from the bank parking lot, letting my voice quaver. I told him there'd been some confusion, that I couldn't access my account for groceries. He took a full 10 seconds before responding, and I could hear the calculation in that silence. Then he told me not to worry, that he'd bring me some cash for necessities, that it was probably better if he managed my finances anyway given my age and the stress I was under. He showed up that evening with $200 in 20s and a speech about fiscal responsibility. He suggested I give him receipts for everything I spent so he could track my expenses. For my own protection, he claimed. Jessica added that elderly people were often targets for scams, that it was actually kind of Brandon to take this burden off my shoulders. I thanked them with tears in my eyes. Real tears, but not for the reasons they thought. The cameras caught it all. The condescension, the control, the casual cruelty of cutting off a 69-year-old woman's financial independence days after she'd buried her husband. Susan's nephew, the private investigator, came through with his report on day 12. Brandon's financials were a masterpiece of fraud. Shell companies, diverted contracts, fake consulting fees. But there was more. He'd been living far beyond even his legitimate means. A $60,000 car lease, a boat he couldn't afford, gambling debts in Atlantic City that explained why he needed money so desperately. Jessica's background was equally enlightening. She'd been married once before, to an elderly man in Savannah. He'd died suddenly, leaving everything to her. His children had contested, claiming undue influence, but settled out of court. The pattern was unmistakable. My son hadn't just married a woman who looked good in designer clothes. He'd married a predator who recognized another predator. On day 15, they brought the Meadowbrook intake coordinator to my house. Her name was Patricia, and she had the forced cheerfulness of someone selling a product she wouldn't use herself. She talked about activities and meal plans and medication management while Jessica nodded encouragingly. Brandon watched me like a hawk, waiting for resistance. I asked about the garden. Could I have plants in my room? Patricia's smile faltered. She said private rooms didn't have windows, but there was a lovely courtyard all residents could enjoy during supervised outdoor time. I said it sounded wonderful and asked when I could move in. The relief on Brandon's face was worth every ounce of rage I was swallowing. He told Patricia they'd be in touch soon, very soon, and walked her out with promises of a swift transition. After they left, I sat in Henry's study and whispered to the empty room, "You saw him, didn't you? You knew." 15 days down, 15 to go. I just had to hold on a little longer. Susan found the original contract on day 17, the one Henry had drafted 3 years ago, making me a full partner in the business with rights that superseded any inheritance provisions. Brandon didn't know it existed because Henry had kept it in a safety deposit box at a different bank, one my son had never thought to check. That partnership agreement nullified almost everything Brandon claimed. The house wasn't an estate asset. It was marital property with right of survivorship. The business assets couldn't be liquidated without my signature. Even the company accounts required dual authorization for any transaction over $50,000. My husband had protected me years before he died. He'd just hidden it so well that even I hadn't known. Mr. Henderson came to Susan's house to review everything. He spread documents across her dining table: the partnership agreement, the dignity clause, the camera footage, the financial evidence of Brandon's theft. He told me that Henry had spent the last year of his life building an ironclad case, not just to protect me, but to save his son from himself. The dignity clause was Henry's last hope. If Brandon treated me with respect during those 30 days, if he showed even a shred of decency, he'd inherit everything despite the theft. Henry would have let it go, let his son have the money, and prayed he'd use it wisely. The clause was an escape hatch, a final chance for Brandon to prove he was redeemable. My son was failing that test spectacularly. The camera footage from day 18 showed Brandon in my bedroom, going through my jewelry box. He held up my mother's engagement ring, the one piece of jewelry I'd explicitly asked to keep, and told Jessica it was worth at least $15,000. She suggested they get it appraised quietly before including it in the estate inventory. The way she said inventory made it clear that ring would never make it onto any official list. I watched that footage in Mr. Henderson's office and felt something inside me calcify. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about my son looking at his mother's most precious possession and seeing only dollar signs. Susan's nephew delivered more evidence. Brandon had already contacted business competitors about selling Henry's company. He'd been shopping it around for weeks, taking meetings, promising quick deals and cut-rate prices. He was planning to flip everything and run, probably before anyone realized what he'd stolen. On day 21, Brandon brought his own lawyer to my house, a slick young man from a downtown firm who specialized in probate law. They sat me down at my own kitchen table and put papers in front of me, documents that would grant Brandon immediate power of attorney, documents that would authorize the home sale, documents that would commit me to Meadowbrook. The lawyer used words like streamlined and simplified and in your best interest. Brandon added that this would help me avoid stress, that he'd handle all the difficult decisions, that I could just relax and let him take care of everything the way a good son should. I picked up the pen. I let it hover over the signature line, while Brandon leaned forward eagerly. Then I set it down and said I needed to think about it, maybe have my own lawyer review everything first. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Brandon's jaw tightened. He told me that delays would only complicate matters, that his lawyer had assured him these were standard documents, that my refusing to sign showed exactly why these protections were necessary. I clearly wasn't capable of making sound judgments anymore. His lawyer looked uncomfortable. He gathered the papers and suggested they give me a few days to consider. Brandon's glare could have melted steel, but he forced a smile and agreed. 3 days. That's all I got. After they left, I called Mr. Henderson. 7 days remained on the dignity clause evaluation. Brandon's own lawyer had just witnessed him pressuring a grieving widow to sign away her autonomy. It was on camera, time-stamped, documented. Susan came over that night with a bottle of wine. We sat in the garden Henry had loved, and she asked how I was holding up. I told her the truth. I felt like I was watching my son from a great distance, like he'd been replaced by a stranger who wore his face but had none of his soul. She reminded me that Henry had seen this coming, that he'd given Brandon every opportunity to choose differently, that what happened next wasn't my failure as a mother. But it felt like failure anyway. What had I missed? What signs had I ignored while my son learned to value money more than family? On day 25, Brandon called me from his car. His voice was tight, stressed. He said we needed to talk about the estate timeline, that things were taking too long, that he had opportunities that required immediate liquidity. He asked, more directly than before, when I was planning to sign those documents. I told him I was still thinking about it. He hung up without saying goodbye. Mr. Henderson called an hour later. Brandon had tried to access company accounts that required my authorization. When the bank refused, he'd threatened legal action. He was getting desperate, making mistakes. The trap was almost ready to spring. 5 more days. The call came on day 27 from a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice, nervous and young, asked if I was Margaret. When I confirmed, she said her name was Amy and that she worked at Meadowbrook Senior Care. She needed to talk to me about Brandon. We met at a coffee shop in Mount Pleasant, far enough from Charleston that we wouldn't be spotted. Amy was maybe 30, with tired eyes and the kind of face that had seen too much too soon. She stirred her coffee for a full minute before speaking. She told me Brandon had toured Meadowbrook 3 times. He'd been very specific about what he wanted. A shared room, not private. Basic care package, nothing premium. He'd asked detailed questions about how quickly they could admit someone, whether there were waiting periods, how the billing worked. Then he'd asked about their dementia unit. I didn't have dementia. My mind was sharp as ever. Amy's hands shook as she explained what happened next. Brandon had inquired about residents who had difficulty with memory, who might be confused about their finances, who might need help managing their affairs. He'd wanted to know how families typically handled asset transfers for residents with cognitive decline. The questions had made her supervisor uncomfortable enough to flag them internally. But what really made Amy reach out was the payment discussion. Brandon had negotiated rock-bottom rates for my care, less than half what comparable facilities charged. He'd explained that funds were limited, that as a dutiful son, he was trying to stretch my resources. Then he'd casually mentioned that once I was settled, he'd be handling all my financial and legal matters, and that Meadowbrook should send all bills directly to him for payment. Amy had worked in elder care for 8 years. She recognized the setup: get the parent declared incompetent, institutionalize them in substandard care, take control of their assets, then let the care deteriorate because nobody's watching. She'd seen it before. She'd reported it before. And every time, by the time anyone investigated, it was too late. She risked her job by warning me. I held her hand across that coffee shop table and thanked her through tears. Mr. Henderson added Amy's testimony to the file. It painted a clear picture of Brandon's intentions. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about erasing me completely. On day 28, Jessica made her own mistake. She came to the house alone while Brandon was at a supposed business meeting. I was in the garden, pruning roses, when she found me. She'd brought a stack of clothing catalogs and suggested we look at options for my new wardrobe. Meadowbrook had a dress code, she explained. Nothing too complicated since I'd need to dress myself. She flipped through pages showing institutional clothing: elastic waistbands, Velcro closures, fabric that could withstand industrial washing. She talked about practicality and comfort like she was outfitting a child for summer camp. Then she mentioned, almost offhand, that I wouldn't need much jewelry where I was going. Meadowbrook's policy prohibited valuables for safety reasons. I asked what would happen to my jewelry. Jessica smiled. She assured me that Brandon would keep everything secure, perhaps in a safe deposit box, or maybe they'd sell some pieces to help fund my care. My mother's ring, for instance, would be better off converted to cash that could ensure I had quality care for years. The camera in the porch light fixture caught every word. That evening, Susan and I reviewed all 28 days of footage. It was damning. Brandon and Jessica had documented their own crime, performing their cruelty so naturally they'd forgotten to hide it even in my own home. But Mr. Henderson warned us about the final 2 days. People sometimes got lucky. Sometimes they figured out they were being watched. Sometimes they pulled back just enough to save themselves. We couldn't let that happen. On day 29, I called Brandon and told him I was ready to sign the papers. My voice shook convincingly as I said I'd been selfish, that he was right to help me make these difficult decisions, that I trusted him completely to handle everything. The relief in his voice was almost heartbreaking. He said he'd come by first thing in the morning, day 30, with his lawyer and the realtor. We'd sign everything at once, get me moved into Meadowbrook by the end of the week. He told me he was proud of me for being reasonable, that this was the right choice, that I'd see how much easier life would be once I let him handle the complicated parts. I hung up and sat in the gathering darkness of my living room. Tomorrow was the day. Tomorrow, the 30-day evaluation period ended. Tomorrow, Mr. Henderson would make his final determination about whether Brandon had violated the dignity clause. Tomorrow, my son would learn what happened when you underestimated the wrong woman. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in Henry's study, surrounded by 45 years of memories, and talked to my husband's ghost. I told him I understood now why he'd done it this way, why he'd given Brandon just enough rope, why he'd trusted me to be strong enough to endure it. At dawn on day 30, I put on my best dress and my mother's ring. It was time for the final act. Brandon arrived at 9 sharp, practically vibrating with anticipation. He had his lawyer, the realtor Brittany, and Jessica all in tow like an entourage. They filled my living room with briefcases and contracts and the kind of aggressive cheerfulness that made my skin crawl. I'd set out coffee and pastries like we were celebrating something. In a way, I suppose we were. Brandon spread the documents across my dining table, the same table where we'd shared thousands of family meals. The power of attorney form was on top, flagged with bright yellow tabs everywhere I needed to sign. Below that, the authorization to sell the house. Below that, the Meadowbrook admission papers. Below that, consent forms for Brandon to access my medical records, my bank accounts, my safety deposit box. He'd thought of everything except the possibility that I already knew. His lawyer went through each document with practiced efficiency. He explained that I was granting Brandon full authority to make healthcare decisions, financial decisions, legal decisions, that I was acknowledging my declining capacity to manage my own affairs, that I was voluntarily choosing supervised care at Meadowbrook. I picked up the pen. Brandon leaned forward, unable to hide his eagerness. That's when I asked the question that changed everything. Will I be able to see Henry's grave from Meadowbrook? The room went silent. Jessica glanced at Brandon. The lawyer cleared his throat. I kept my voice small and confused. I mentioned that Henry was buried in Magnolia Cemetery, that I visited every Sunday, that I needed to be close to him. Could someone drive me? Would there be transportation? Brandon's mask cracked just slightly. He told me Meadowbrook was in North Charleston, quite far from the cemetery. Visits wouldn't be practical, but they had a lovely chapel on site where I could remember Henry privately. I let tears fill my eyes. I said I'd promised to visit every week, that I'd never miss a Sunday in 45 years of marriage. I couldn't stop now. Jessica jumped in with her practiced sweetness. She reminded me that my health had to come first, that Henry would understand, that I needed to focus on my own care now. She patted my hand and suggested that perhaps my memory of those promises was getting fuzzy. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Brandon shot him a warning look. I asked how much the Meadowbrook care would cost. Brandon had been vague before, always changing the subject. Now, cornered at the signing table, he had to answer. He named a figure that was less than half what decent care should cost. When I pointed this out, gently, like I was genuinely confused, he explained that he'd negotiated special rates, that basic care was all I really needed. I wondered aloud whether the house sale would cover years of care. Brandon assured me it would, that he'd manage the money carefully, that I didn't need to worry about finances. Then I asked the question that made his face go pale. What happens to the rest of the money from the house sale? The lawyer's pen stopped moving. Even Brittany looked interested. Brandon stammered something about estate expenses and business obligations. I asked, very innocently, if I'd have access to any of my own money after the sale. He told me I wouldn't need access, that he'd pay all my bills directly, that this arrangement was simpler. I set down the pen and said I needed to use the bathroom before signing. My hands were shaking, this time not from acting. In the bathroom, I splashed water on my face and stared at my reflection. 69 years old, a widow of less than a month, about to blow up my only child's life. When I came back, they were talking in hushed tones. The conversation stopped abruptly when I entered. I apologized for the delay and reached for the pen again. Then my phone rang. Mr. Henderson's name appeared on the screen. I answered it on speaker, my hands conveniently too shaky to hold it properly. Mr. Henderson's voice was formal and clear. He informed me that the 30-day evaluation period specified in Henry's will had concluded as of midnight. He needed me to come to his office immediately for an urgent meeting regarding the estate. He asked if Brandon was present. When I confirmed he was, Mr. Henderson requested that my son accompany me. Brandon demanded to know what this was about. Mr. Henderson simply repeated that it was urgent and that we both needed to be there within the hour. I looked at my son with wide, frightened eyes and asked if I was in trouble, if I'd done something wrong. He assured me through gritted teeth that everything was fine, that this was probably just a formality. But his face had gone gray. Some part of him knew. We left the unsigned documents on the table. Brittany and the lawyer gathered their things awkwardly, promising to reschedule. Jessica said she'd wait at the house. Brandon told her to go home. He didn't know how long this would take. The drive to Mr. Henderson's office took 20 minutes. Brandon spent the entire time on his phone, making calls to his own lawyer, his voice getting progressively more tense. He kept asking what the 30-day evaluation period meant, whether I knew anything about it. I told him honestly that I didn't know, that Henry had kept many things from me, that I was just as confused as he was. That last part, at least, was a lie. We pulled into the parking garage at 10:30 on day 30. The final hour had come. Mr. Henderson's conference room felt like a courtroom. He'd arranged chairs facing a large screen, and the formality of the setup made Brandon pace near the windows. His lawyer had beaten us there and was already reviewing documents with increasing alarm. Susan sat in the corner. Her presence made Brandon stop pacing. He demanded to know why she was here, what this was all about, why his mother's neighbor needed to be involved in private estate matters. Mr. Henderson simply asked us all to sit down. He began by reading from Henry's will, not the portion Brandon had heard at the first reading, but a section that had been sealed for 30 days. His voice was measured and professional as he explained the dignity clause. Henry had included a provision that allowed for a complete reversal of the inheritance if Brandon demonstrated behavior unbecoming of a son during the month following the funeral. Brandon interrupted, his voice rising. This was absurd. There was no such clause. His lawyer had reviewed the will. This was some kind of fraud. Mr. Henderson slid a document across the table. The original will with Henry's signature, dated and witnessed. The dignity clause was there in black and white. Brandon's lawyer went pale as he read it. Then Mr. Henderson explained the monitoring system. For 30 days, my home had been under audio and video surveillance. Every conversation, every interaction, every moment Brandon had spent in that house had been recorded as evidence for the evaluation. Brandon shot to his feet. This was illegal. This violated privacy laws. He'd sue for invasion of privacy, for manipulation, for elder abuse. Mr. Henderson calmly noted that the house belonged to the estate Henry controlled, that consent for surveillance had been granted by the legal owner, Henry himself, before his death, and that all monitoring had been conducted within the bounds of South Carolina law. He asked Brandon to sit down. There was more. The screen flickered to life. The first clip showed Brandon at the funeral reception, ignoring me while networking. The second showed him announcing his plans to sell my house 2 days after Henry's burial. The third captured his joke about $20 for taxi fare, while everyone laughed at my expense. Brandon tried to object, tried to claim context was missing, but Mr. Henderson played clip after clip. Brandon freezing my bank accounts, Jessica cataloging my jewelry, the Meadowbrook tour, and the questions about dementia patients. The real estate agent walking through my home, calling it dated and tragic, while Brandon nodded along. The camera had caught everything: his condescension, his greed, his casual cruelty. 30 days of evidence that my son viewed me as an obstacle to be removed rather than a mother to be cherished. But Mr. Henderson wasn't finished. He pulled out Susan's nephew's investigation, the shell companies, the embezzlement, the $2 million Brandon had stolen from Henry's company while his father was alive. Bank statements, forged contracts, evidence that would hold up in criminal court. Brandon's lawyer was already gathering his things. He told Brandon not to say another word, that he needed a criminal defense attorney immediately. Brandon ignored him. He stood there staring at the screen, showing his own face, his own words, his own crimes. Then Mr. Henderson read the final determination. Based on the evidence collected during the 30-day evaluation period, Brandon had comprehensively violated the dignity clause. He demonstrated greed, cruelty, manipulation, and a complete absence of filial respect. Therefore, according to the terms of Henry's will, the inheritance distribution was hereby reversed. The company, valued at $25 million, reverted to me. The investment accounts, the properties, the business assets, everything Brandon thought he'd inherited now belonged to his mother, the woman he'd tried to institutionalize in a cut-rate facility while selling her home out from under her. For Brandon, the will now provided exactly what he'd once joked about: $3,000. I spoke for the first time since entering the room. My voice didn't shake. I told Brandon that I'd also be pursuing criminal charges for the embezzlement, that the evidence was already prepared for the district attorney, that he'd stolen from his own father while Henry was dying. Jessica called him 17 times while we sat in that conference room. She left voicemails asking what was taking so long, whether the house sale was finalized, when she could start shopping for their new boat. By the time Brandon walked out of Mr. Henderson's office 3 hours later, she'd already heard through Charleston's very efficient gossip network that the inheritance was gone. She'd filed for divorce before the week was out. Brandon tried to threaten legal action. His new lawyer explained that the will was airtight, the surveillance was legal, and the criminal evidence was damning. Any lawsuit would only draw more attention to his theft. Brandon dropped it after a month. The last time I saw my son before he moved away, he was loading boxes into a 10-year-old sedan. The $60,000 car had been repossessed. The boat had never been his to begin with. He'd aged 10 years in 30 days. He looked at me standing on the porch of the home he'd tried to steal, and I saw something that might have been shame or might have been rage. I never found out which, because I went inside and closed the door. Henry had protected me one final time, and I'd found the strength to protect myself. Brandon's criminal trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution had everything: the forged contracts, the shell company accounts, the $2 million he'd siphoned from Henry's business over 8 months. His lawyer negotiated a plea deal: 5 years probation, full restitution, and a fraud conviction on his permanent record. The judge asked if I wanted to make a statement at sentencing. I stood in that courtroom and looked at my son in his cheap suit, the one he'd bought at a discount store because his designer clothes had been sold to pay legal fees. I could have destroyed him with my words. Instead, I told the judge that Brandon was my only child, that I'd failed him somehow in raising him, but that I hoped this would be his chance to learn what Henry had tried to teach him: that integrity matters more than money. Brandon didn't look at me. He'd stopped looking at me entirely after the inheritance reversal. Jessica's divorce was finalized before his probation started. She moved to Atlanta with a businessman she'd met online, someone else with assets worth managing. I heard through Susan that she'd already convinced him to add her to his accounts. Some people never learn. Some people never want to. The business required immediate attention. Henry's partner, Thomas, had been running operations in my husband's absence, but decisions had been piling up. I called a board meeting and informed everyone that I was now majority owner. There were skeptical faces around that table. 69-year-old widows weren't supposed to understand logistics and supply chains. Then I presented the evidence of Brandon's embezzlement and explained how I'd been working with forensic accountants to trace every missing dollar. I outlined my plan to restructure the company, install new financial controls, and promote Thomas to CEO while I maintained board oversight. By the end of that meeting, the skepticism had shifted to respect. I offered Amy, the Meadowbrook worker who'd warned me, a job at our company as a compliance officer. She accepted immediately, grateful to escape elder care facilities that valued profit over people. Her first task was helping me establish the foundation I'd been planning since the day the inheritance was reversed. The Margaret Hayes Foundation for Elder Protection launched 6 months after Henry's death. We funded legal assistance for elderly victims of financial exploitation, supported legislation for stronger elder abuse protections, and created a hotline for seniors who suspected family members were stealing from them. Amy ran it brilliantly, bringing the same fierce protectiveness she'd shown when warning me about Brandon. Susan became the foundation's legal counsel. She recruited other retired lawyers, and together they'd won back millions of dollars for families victimized by predatory relatives. Every case reminded me that I'd been lucky. I'd had Henry's foresight and Susan's friendship. Most elderly victims had neither. The house required work after months of Brandon and Jessica's cataloging and planning. I had rooms repainted, replacing colors they'd criticized. I installed a new security system, changed every lock, and reclaimed the space they'd tried to take from me. The garden became my sanctuary again, the place where I talked to Henry among the roses he'd planted. I visited his grave every Sunday, keeping the promise I'd nearly been prevented from fulfilling. Sometimes I brought news of the foundation's successes. Sometimes I just sat there in silence, feeling the weight of 45 years together. I always thanked him for seeing what I couldn't see, for loving me enough to protect me even after death. The $3,000 designated for Brandon in the will sat in an account I'd opened in his name. I added to it monthly, matching what he paid in restitution, building it back toward something meaningful. It was locked until he completed his probation and attended financial counseling. Part of me hoped he'd use it to rebuild his life properly. Part of me knew he probably wouldn't. But Henry had taught me that hope costs nothing and sometimes saves everything. I sold the boat Brandon had purchased with stolen money. The proceeds went to the foundation. I sold his luxury car, his designer watches, all the things he'd bought with embezzled funds. Every piece of his greed was converted into protection for other elderly victims. There was poetry in that. Thomas and I expanded the business beyond South Carolina, opening new distribution centers and hiring people Henry would have approved of. Honest workers who valued integrity over shortcuts. The company thrived, and I learned that 69 wasn't too old to understand balance sheets and logistics routes. It just required patience and a willingness to ask questions. I took my first solo trip at 70, flying to Italy like I'd promised myself. I walked through Florence and Rome, thinking about the woman I'd been a year ago, the one who'd stood in the rain watching her husband's burial and feeling utterly alone. That woman wouldn't recognize who I'd become. Brandon sent a letter on the 1-year anniversary of Henry's death. He didn't apologize for the theft or the cruelty, but he acknowledged that his father had been right to protect me. He was working at a hardware store, managing inventory, living in a studio apartment. He mentioned that the simplicity was difficult, but clarifying. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask for money. He just wanted me to know he was still here. I wrote back, not to reconcile, not to forgive, I wasn't ready for either, but to let him know that when he finished probation and counseling, the $3,000 would be waiting. What he did with it would determine whether there could ever be anything between us again. I'm 70 now. The foundation has helped over 200 families. The business has doubled its revenue. I've traveled to 6 countries and have plans for 6 more. I've learned to manage board meetings and legal consultations and forensic audits. I've discovered that grief and joy can coexist. That strength comes in forms you never expect, and that sometimes the people who underestimate you do you the biggest favor of your life. Henry's joke about $20 taught Brandon a lesson worth millions. It taught me that I was never as helpless as everyone assumed. Age didn't make me weak. It gave me decades of wisdom they'd underestimated. I'm standing in my garden right now, the one they tried to call wasted space. The roses are blooming, and I can feel Henry here among them. I like to think he's proud of the woman I became after he was gone. Not despite his death, but because of the final gift he left me, the chance to save myself. If you're watching this from somewhere in the world where someone is trying to convince you you're too old, too confused, or too much trouble, remember my story. Age is not weakness, experience is not obsolescence, and sometimes the best inheritance is the chance to prove them all wrong. Subscribe if this story meant something to you, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know this message reached you, wherever you are.